Good Saturday morning to you. All week long, we've been talking about prayer and fasting, hearing from people that went through a 14-week challenge within our own congregation. And I hope that those testimonies have been meaningful for you. And I want to express my gratitude to the people that were willing to share their experiences with us. So thank you for doing that. I thought we would continue this morning on this theme of prayer and fasting, because whether or not you've realized it, you're in the midst, we are all in the midst of an imposed fasting. We are having to fast from many things. And so I shared with you yesterday that I had the privilege of participating in a time of prayer and a discussion on prayer during this pandemic season the other night. And I want to share some of the thoughts with you of the speakers. And I took lots of notes because this is just a passion of mine. Prayer is a passion of mine. And these are some of the giants in the faith, people I think are giants in the faith. So let me share some of their thoughts with you. And I hope you'll take some notes and really think about some of these ideas that were expressed. First of all, Brett Heinzman, who is the director of the National Prayer Ministry for the Free Methodist Church. He shared these thoughts that this season that we're in, this pandemic season, is exposing the effectiveness of our discipleship. And he said that our churches cannot experience revival until our homes do. And so this was a question he posed, or a thought he posed. If you're a parent of children of any age, I'm a parent, even though my daughter's an adult, but if you're a parent, think about this. Could you lead a worship time in your own home? Or are you dependent on having to tune into a time of worship? Well, what does that look like? I mean, could you assign somebody in your family the role of being the person who prays, who does a pastoral prayer and enters into the season of worship at that time? Could that person lead in a time of prayer? Is there somebody that could do a biblical message? Could somebody do some Bible study throughout the week, make notes on it, and then present that as a sermon or a devotional to the family? And could someone do the setup and the preparation and the execution of Holy Communion? Do you know the biblical story enough, or could you find it in the scriptures and read it and do the setup? You've sat through thousands of communion celebrations in your own local church. Could you do that for your family, or could someone in your family do that? So those are some questions to think through. Now, there's nothing wrong with tuning into a worship service. There's nothing wrong with that. But the question is, have you been discipled well enough, or have you allowed yourself to be discipled well enough to be able to lead and engage your family in a time of worship? And then Dr. David Thomas, the director of New Room, had some great thoughts. He said, everything that the church has idolized has now been stripped away. We've seen our buildings are not necessary to have church. Our buildings are not necessary to carry out ministry. Our buildings are not necessary to have Bible times, Bible study times, or prayer times. The buildings are not necessary for that. Our programs are no longer even relevant, or they've had to been totally restructured during this time if we're going to continue ministry. And so this is going to be a huge loss to the church if all we do is go back to normal. And so his statement that was so profound to me was this: we can either endure this season of fasting, or we can engage in it. Meaning we can just wait it out and then go back to normal, or we can really engage in it and have every single person, not just the pastor, not just the church leaders, but every single person right now should be considering, what can we do differently? What can I do differently to be better at doing the two things Jesus wants us to do in the church? And that is, we are to follow him and we are to go fishing for people. So think about those things. What can you individually do to be a better disciple? And what can you individually do to be better at going and fishing for people? And then J.D. Wall, the author of Seedbed Daily Text. Some of you I know participate in the daily text. I've been doing that with a group of my friends, and we have formed a band and we study together every morning, and we have done so for the last 6 years, I think as long as Seedbed has been doing the daily text. So J.D. Wall is the sower-in-chief there of Seedbed, and I loved some of the things that he said about prayer. He said, creating space for prayer creates space for God. So when you sit down for your prayer time, are you creating space for God? And then listen to this. I think this might have been the most profound statement of the night for me. He said, we should bring nothing into that space but desperation to hear from God. Is that what your prayer time looks like? Do you sit down and are you just desperate to hear from God? Or do you have your laundry list that you're going to run through? Now, there's nothing wrong with giving God your requests. There's nothing wrong with that. But are you creating that space for him to talk to you? And are you desperate to hear from him? So I want to leave you with those thoughts for this weekend and weeks to come. Are you creating space for God? How can you be a better disciple that makes disciples? And can you lead a time of worship with your own family? And I also want to let you know what's coming up. I'm starting a series of messages tomorrow that are based on this book, Feeding Your Appetites by Stephen Arterburn. I read this, I don't know, in the last year or so. If you haven't figured out, I'm an avid reader. I read about 3 books every month, maybe a little more right now. But I read this book and thought this was something that we should be discussing, because God put within each one of us 8 appetites. Now, some of our appetites we can probably figure out pretty easily, but I doubt we can guess all 8 of them. And so we're going to take some time and go through this, because some of these appetites we overindulge in and others we starve. So we'll be looking at those 8 appetites. So I hope you'll be back to go through that time with us in these messages, because we have time now to look at these appetites and see how we're either feeding them or overindulging in them, or maybe we're starving some of our appetites that need to be fed. So I hope you'll be here for those.